Thank you for joining us this evening. It's such a pleasure to have Kishore Mahbubani and Anne Mahbubani with us this evening. Kishore hardly needs an introduction. He's known to the whole world as one of the most lively commentators on the rise of China and the reactions of countries not just in Asia but across the world to that rise. But for those of you who don't know, Kishore served as Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations during a particularly interesting period and very quickly made his name as one of the more outspoken and effective ambassadors in the United Nations. He's done many things, and I'm not going to take up airtime with my words because we're going to hear from Kishore himself. But he, of particular interest to the school was his role as Dean of the Kuan School of Government. And right from the early moment of birth of this school, Kishore has been a wonderful inspiration and advisor on what we should do with this school. So it's a particular pleasure to welcome him back to the Blavatnik School of Government. Kishore's new book, Has the West Lost It? Another provocation for us, and about which he will say more this evening. Kishore's going to speak for about 30 minutes?
No, less.
No,
15,
20 minutes.
15.
So that we can engage in... Wonderful. It's music to the ears of those of you who have come with questions. But what I really want to say to you is please prepare your questions so we can move straight into this very special opportunity to question the man in person. So please join me in welcoming Kishore Mahbubani.
Thank you very much, Ngaire. It's such a pleasure to be back in the Blavatnik. We've been admiring this tremendous rise of the Blavatnik School from afar. You've done a spectacular job, Ngaire, as founding dean, and you're also a source of inspiration all over the world. Now, as you know, when you begin a speech, the Americans begin with a joke. The Asians begin with an apology. But I'm going to actually begin with a genuine apology. This might be, I hope you won't treat this as a hit-and-run operation. I actually have to leave at 6 o'clock sharp because there's another batch of students waiting somewhere else to hear me speak at 6 o'clock, apparently, so I've been told to dash out. But I'll try to make this event here as meaningful for you as possible, because clearly, if there's one thing that is going to affect all your lives in a very profound way, is what's going to happen between US and China. So it doesn't matter where you are. It could be in Africa, Latin America, Asia, Europe. We will all be affected by it. So it's important to try and understand that dynamic and its implications for the world. In fact, I actually going to try and write a book on the subject, which I haven't found a provocative title yet, but I'll try to find one. So what I propose to do in about 15, 20 minutes, because I want to leave lots of time for Q&A, is to divide my remarks into three parts. First, I want to talk about the global context, and I'll explain why that's important. Then I'll talk about the factors that are driving the US-China relationship. And thirdly, in a sense, that I'll conclude very briefly with how the implications are for the rest of the world, because that's, of course, relevant to all of us. So in part one, I want to begin with the global context, because what happens to the US-China rivalry also depends very much on the global context. And if you all believe that the world is, spinning out of control, getting worse and worse, things are really bad, the world is getting to be a dangerous place, and you might think, gosh, all is lost. But so I want to begin by saying that contrary to especially the conventional wisdom in Europe, the world has never been in a better place. And to just state a very simple, bald fact, that the human condition has improved more in the last 30 years than it has in the past 3,000 years. So future historians will see our times as the best of times. And it's important for us to know that, because that backdrop will help to cushion some of the problems that you get from the US US-China rivalry. And if you want to understand what I mean by saying this is the best of times, let me just give you 3 examples, which I actually taken from my book. The first is that if you look at it in terms of war and peace, it's actually not becoming a more dangerous world. In fact, if you look at the work of Steven Pinker, both in The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, he gives all kinds of data to show that this is the most peaceful era ever in human history. As I quote him from the book, he says, global violence has fallen steadily from 65,000 people dying per year in the 1950s to less than 2,000 per year now in interstate wars. Take another area of human welfare and well-being, the fight to get rid of extreme poverty. We thought that this was a fight we could never win. But here, the story is even more amazing because in 1950, which by the way is not so long ago, it's 2 years after I was born, 1950, 75% of the world's population were living in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 10%. Never before in human history have we lifted up so many people from extreme poverty. And if you want one last statistic, if you look at the global middle class populations, they're exploding now from 1.8 billion in 2010 to 3.2 billion in 2020 to 4.9 billion by 2030. More than half the world's population is going to enjoy global middle class living standards. So it's a happy world. But in this happy world, and this brings me to part 2 of my remarks, we are also going to experience geopolitical turbulence. And I can absolutely guarantee you one thing, that relations between US and China will get worse. You don't have to be a geopolitical genius to predict it. And it's actually happening very fast. This year I was on a sabbatical in Columbia and Harvard universities, February, March, April, and I saw relations between US and China drifting down. I went back to Georgetown University in October, and they had gone to a dive. And you've seen this in the trade war and other things. So the question is, what's driving this? And here the key point I want to make to you is that the US-China relationship is an extremely complex one. It's driven by many different dimensions. Each dimension has got its own logic. And then having that complexity not just within one dimension, but having 5 dimensions interacting with each other makes it a very difficult relationship to understand and to predict. And I'm going to just briefly go through the 5 dimensions. The first one, of course, is the economic dimension, and you can see it happening. The trade war has begun. And by the way, in 2 days' time, there will be a very important meeting between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping in Argentina. And we are only 48 hours away from the meeting. And we have no idea what's going to happen. It's a remarkable thing. Normally, by now, before the 2 leaders meet, 48 hours beforehand, everything is cooked. In the case of Donald Trump, nothing is cooked. So you have no idea what he's going to do. And he's amazingly unpredictable. And the first question is, who's right, who's wrong in this thing? Now, clearly, if you look at it objectively, Trump is wrong in his belief that all these trade deficits are bad for the US economy. I spoke to one of the leading trade economists in Harvard who said if Donald Trump sat for an Economics 101 exam on international trade, he would fail. Because he sees deficits as business losses and trade surpluses as business profits. Now, that's rubbish, but he believes it. So he's launched a war that cannot be justified. But at the same time, what's stunning is that even though Donald Trump's trade war cannot be justified, it's getting massive support in the United States. In fact, the only one issue on which Donald Trump gets bipartisan support is the trade war that he has launched against China. And it shows clearly that China has made some mistakes in this area. It has alienated significant elements of the American community, especially the business community. The business community used to put the brakes on anti-China sentiment in the US. Now they've taken their foot off the brake. And so you see now this trade war carrying on. And it will have, and the rights and wrongs, of course, I'll discuss in my book, but it's a complex, complicated matter. And as I said, in 48 hours, maybe things might improve, things might get worse. We don't know. That's one dimension. Then you have the political dimension. And in the political dimension, unlike the economic dimension where you can at least try to figure out a win-win understanding between US and China, it's possible for US and China to reach a win-win agreement in economics, where the US economy benefits, Chinese economy benefits, it can be done. But in the politics side, it's a zero-sum game. What do I mean by a zero-sum game? Because the United States believed, apparently quite genuinely and sincerely, that as it engaged with China, as it opened its markets to China, China would open up its economy, its people would integrate with the rest of the world, and of course, as a result of that, China would also open up its political system, and eventually China would become a liberal democracy. And if that was a genuine expectation. You can find speeches by Bill Clinton saying that in support of China's admission to WTO. And he said, if China joins the WTO, its political system will open up. And lo and behold, the world will be a happy place. But as you all know, the opposite has happened. If there's anything that's happened in the last 5 years, the Chinese Communist Party has become even more strongly established in its power, and President Xi Jinping is probably one of the most powerful leaders that China has had. So instead of China moving towards liberal democracy, China is actually becoming a much more strongly run government by the Chinese Communist Party. And clearly, the Americans believe, they feel let down, they say, what's happening? We expected something, and the opposite has happened. And so the question, therefore, is in each of these dimensions, who's right and who's wrong? And the United States is absolutely convinced that the American political experience is universally applicable, and any society that copies the United States will rise and flourish and succeed. And that's why they believe that China is better off becoming a democracy. But they do this on the basis of the fact that the United States, as you know, was founded in 1776, is a republic that's less than 250 years old. By contrast, China has had, I guess, a continuous history. You can go back either 2,400, 3,000, 4,000 years, as you whatever date you choose. The Chinese have had 2,400 years of political experience or so. And the 2,400 years of Chinese history has taught one fundamental lesson to the Chinese leaders, that if the center is not strong, the country will crumble and the people will suffer. If you want the people to be better off, the center must be strong. And in the case of the Chinese, this desire to have a strong center is also a result of what they call the 100 years of humiliation, because when they were weak, the Western powers came in, took up parts of Chinese territory, forced China to buy opium, the Japanese invaded. So they've gone through 100 years of hell. So here they are with their belief that a strong China is what China needs, and the United States saying, no, that's the wrong thing. You can see clearly that there's no room for compromise in the 2 points of view. And that will be one source of clear friction between the US and China. And then, of course, you'll also have the third dimension of competition will be in the military dimension. And here some very famous analysts, including Graham Allison, like Ngaire and me, also a dean once. Graham Allison has come out with a book called Destined for War. And having studied all the previous cases of power transition, he's come to the conclusion in his book, which he says, war is more likely than not between US and China. So let me at least drop in a piece of good news here and quickly assure you there'll be no war between US and China. There'll be no war between the US and China because a nuclear war means you don't have a winner and a loser, you have two losers. So fortunately, nuclear weapons, paradoxically, are going to prevent a direct war between US and China. But there will be rising military competition. You saw a few weeks ago a Chinese destroyer, an American destroyer came within 40 yards of having a collision with each other. There'll be lots of near misses that will happen in the military dimension. And of course, what we need to worry about, incidentally, is proxy wars that US and China may launch against each other. So that's the military dimension. Now, the fourth dimension, the cultural dimension, is the most sensitive dimension of all. Because here I'm going to talk about something that is like the invisible elephant present in this room, but we don't want to talk about. And so what is this invisible elephant? To put it in two words, I call it the yellow peril. The yellow peril is a fear that exists somewhere in the subconsciousness of the Western mind. It never floats up, but it's there. It drives your emotions, and when it drives your emotions, it affects your policies too. But you can't talk about it. And because you can't talk about it, you can't deal with it. But it's there. And this will be a very difficult part to understand in terms of the dynamic in US-China relations, because it's a very emotional dimension that will be at play. That is a result of, in a sense, a long history of fear of being invaded by the yellow Mongol tribes that goes back centuries. It's there. And in my case, I can tell you this. I was shocked when I was in Washington, D.C. in October to read this incredibly strong anti-China speech by the Vice President Mike Pence. And nobody criticized it. I was stunned. Completely anti-China speech, not balanced at all. But somehow or other, it's open season. It's okay to attack China. And where does that come from? In my view, part of it also comes from this irrational fear of China. And the fifth and final dimension I'm going to mention is what I call the contest for primacy. And here, the United States has got used to being the number one power in the world over 100 years or more. And the United States has become addicted to being number one. So the idea of becoming number two is virtually unacceptable in American political culture. And yet we know that sometime, we don't know when, by the way, in purchasing power parity terms, China is already a bigger economy. By nominal market terms, within 10 years, within 15 years, it doesn't matter when, it's going to happen. The United States is going to become the number two economic power. And when that happens to a country where you can't speak about becoming number two, it will be a huge political shock, and you will see a lot of political acrimony happening in the United States. And that will also fuel an angry relationship between the United States and China. So you can see how complex this relationship is. There are many different dimensions at play in US-China rivalry. Each of these dimensions has a certain logic, and as a result of that, the likelihood, almost near certainty I can say, that relations between US and China will get worse in the coming years. So let me conclude by asking, so what are the implications for the rest of the world? And clearly there will be negative implications. Many countries will be forced to choose to take sides. Many countries don't want to take sides, and that will be an uncomfortable experience that will come. But at the same time, to balance that, whenever you have a crisis, you have challenges, you also have opportunities. So as a result of this rivalry between US and China, countries are looking for alternatives and trying to find ways and means of balancing the world. And I'll give you some examples of opportunities that have arisen as a result of this rivalry. One, when Donald Trump walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership was, by the way, a geopolitical gift to America because it was a way of entrenching America in East Asia. But Donald Trump unwisely walked away from it. And when he walked away from it, the Trans-Pacific Partnership should have died. But it didn't die. The 11 other countries said, hey, we will stick with it. We want to have more balance in this region. So that's an example of countries saying, we will continue to look for other opportunities. Second new initiative, when the Chinese realize that they are going to deal with the United States of America that is going to challenge China more, China said, okay, the way I protect myself is by improving my relations with my neighbors. I don't know whether you noticed this. Relations between China and Japan have been difficult for a long time. They were difficult, in fact, as recently as 2-3 years ago. But 2 months ago, there was a wonderful, happy meeting between Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Abe of Japan. Why? Because of US-China rivalry. So other things happen. And the third example, of course, is, the Chinese have launched something called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is actually going beyond Central Asia to many countries. And there are many reasons why China launched it, for genuine economic reasons, to try and integrate itself better with the rest of the world. But surely some of it was also driven by a desire to say, if the United States ever tries to isolate China, China will ensure that most countries in the world will want to maintain their good relations with China. And already, if I'm not mistaken, about over 120 countries have China as the number one trading partner, and the United States has got 50 or 60 countries that have the United States as a major trading partner. So all this effort to open up and integrate with the rest of the world is being driven not just by economic reasons, but also by geopolitical reasons, a way of ensuring that the rest of the world doesn't turn against China as US-China rivalry rises. So to conclude, while I'm confident that US-China rivalry will rise in the coming decades, there will also be opportunities for other countries if you are nimble and smart about it. Thank you very much.
So now your chance to... Now your chance to ask Professor Mahbubani questions. Yes, let's start right here.
You didn't mention in your talk climate change. And do you think that after post-Trump, whether that's after one term or 2 terms, that will be a source of continuing friction, or will that be something that would possibly bring China and the United States closer together in a joint endeavor?
Yeah.
Did anyone else have a question on climate change or environment? No, so let's take that one.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised climate change. The disadvantage of speaking 15 to 20 minutes is that you can't cover everything. But if there are forces that are going to minimize US-China competition, these forces will be what I call common global challenges. And these common global challenges include global warming. It could include pandemics. It could include global terrorism. It could include global financial crisis. And you notice that whenever a global crisis breaks out, the US and China actually do get together. In fact, the height of United States-China cooperation in recent time was just after the global financial crisis, when China, I think, contributed $50 billion to the global rescue effort to stabilize the global economy. And under Obama, by the way, if you look at the difference between the Copenhagen conference, where everything fell apart, and the Paris conference, where everything came together, was because there was a meeting of minds under Obama and Xi Jinping and the Indian government too, that we got to work together to deal with this because we will all be affected by it. But unfortunately, as you know, Donald Trump doesn't believe in climate change. He's made no secret about it. And under him, as long as he's president, there'll be no cooperation between US and China. Post-Trump, I hope that will come back. And indeed, I actually, in some ways, the tragedy here is that it may actually be good for the world to have more signs of climate change and global warming, because that might actually finally wake up the leaders of US and China to say, okay, let's work together. So bad news on that front may be good news for the US-China relationship.
Kishore, just before I take the next question, can I just come back to the root of your analysis? So if we think about the two other big moments of global change, so before the First World War, there's a big debate. Was Germany expansionist, or was Germany feeling encircled and constrained? And then, of course, the Cold War begins with the same question. Was the Soviet Union expansionist, as the US believed it was, or was it actually feeling encircled and therefore just trying to state its own claim for it? So what's your view on China? Is China expansionist, or does China feel encircled? In other words, that countries around it are putting unjustifiable limits on its claims to territory and its claims to places where it can exercise power. What's your view?
Well, I would say it's neither expansionist nor encircled. But what is happening clearly is that the Chinese are trying to reclaim what they believe to be their rightful place in the world. And they, as you know, China, if you can imagine what the world was like 100 years ago, right, in 1918, just how weak China was, right, at that point in time. And they, as a result of that 100 years of humiliation, what's driving China psychologically is a desire to be treated with respect by the rest of the world. And the Chinese traditionally, when they become powerful, have not sent armadas out to colonize the world. It's actually quite shocking that Australia, which is so close to China, relatively speaking, was never colonized by the Chinese, but was colonized by the British, who came all the way from the Atlantic to colonize Australia. That's a simple example of how the Chinese didn't have this impulse. But at the same time, as China becomes stronger, it also expects a different relationship with its neighbors. And as you know, throughout history, when China becomes strong, one way the neighbors adjust is to pay some kind of tribute to China. Now, I don't think the old tributary system will come back, but some kind of deference to China will naturally come back. And here it's interesting, you compare how the United States behaved when it emerged as a great power. Look at the years when Teddy Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy, right? Look at what the United States did. He invaded countries, removed governments, and so on and so forth. Will China do that? No. Because that's not part of the Chinese tradition. And in fact, if you look at, and this also goes back in some ways to Chinese strategic culture, which is that the best way to win a war is to not fight it. And which is why one of the stunning differences within China and, let's say, many Western countries, especially the United States, is that if you compare the behavior on the military side, Obama was one of the most peaceful presidents the United States had. But in the last year of the Obama administration, the United States dropped 26,000 bombs on 7 countries. China, by the way, quite remarkably, maybe it's just a temporary lull, but since 1979, which is almost 40 years, China has not fired a bullet across its borders in 40 years. Now, that kind of culture of strategic restraint is a different political animal. Now, this doesn't mean that China will not exert its power, that China will not bully countries. Of course it will bully countries, but that's what all great powers do.
Right. Questions. So here, and we've got 2 at the back there. So if we take you first, yeah?
Hi. So basically, there's a school of thought that argues that China's foreign policy can be interpreted as an extension of its domestic politics. So there might be a sense that domestic fictionalism and a need to justify legitimacy of rule motivates temporary or local forms or manifestations of nationalism in terms of aggression in South China Sea, but also over Senkaku Islands and whatnot. Alternatively, it might be the view that Xi Jinping's attempt to consolidate power or to enshrine his legacy is also in turn connected with an increasing relative imposition or signification of strength against the US and whatnot. So, Professor, how do you feel about this school of thought that posits that domestic politics or domestic factors in China have an active role to play in shaping its foreign policy? And to what extent do you think the interplay between foreign and domestic factors matters in a way we interpret China's future actions or project its trajectory in that sense? Thanks.
Well, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that the country's domestic political situation does affect its foreign policy. There's absolutely no question. This is true of virtually every country in the world. And it's also true that as China succeeds, develops a middle class, the Chinese people are becoming prouder of their success. And it's also true that the Chinese people are becoming more nationalist. That's a fact. And they will actually become more nationalist as they become more powerful. I mean, that's a given fact. The question is, what is the role of the government or the Chinese Communist Party vis-a-vis this nationalism? And here, one of the most provocative things I say, by the way, from time to time, as Ngaire says, I say provocative things. That, you know, when the Americans wish for democracy in China tomorrow, I say be careful. Because if China switches to a democracy tomorrow and you have a democratically elected government in China, watch out. It'll be far more nationalist than the Chinese Communist Party is. In fact, the great global public good that the Chinese Communist Party is delivering to the world is that it is strong enough to bottle up Chinese nationalism. So, for example, when 2 months ago you have these amazing scenes of the Chinese president standing smiling next to the Japanese prime minister, a democratically elected Chinese president would have a very hard time doing that. But the Chinese Communist Party can do that. So in many ways, I actually argue it's actually good for China's political evolution towards a democracy to go slowly, carefully, rather than to have it happen overnight. And if, as long as the Chinese Communist Party is running China, you're going to get more of a rational actor role coming from China, because it's a Communist Party that can manage its domestic situation and therefore can act more rationally outside its borders.
And along here, yeah.
Professor Mahbubani, I'd be interested to know your perspective on this issue as an African. You mentioned the issue of proxy wars and nations being nimble. Coming from South Africa, we are constantly pegged between some threat of AGOA being taken away from us, or being asked for the Dalai Lama not to come to our country, or to pledge a pact, to sign up for some trade deal. If you were President Cyril Ramaphosa right now, and you're in Southern Africa, what are the opportunities you see for interacting with the United States and also with China during a time of such great strategic, challenges?
Well, I think I haven't met President Cyril Ramaphosa, although I've met some other. I've had the good pleasure of actually being to the house of Nelson Mandela. So one of my greatest moments of my life, to have tea in the house of Nelson Mandela. And I've met President Mbeki also. My advice to President Ramaphosa and to anyone else is that, number one, understand that US-China rivalry will rise. It's coming to your shores. Number two, understand what's the fundamental concerns of each of them. And so you make sure that you don't tread on their most sensitive toes. So you mentioned, for example, the Dalai Lama. And it's a fact that countries that receive the Dalai Lama are going to have a very hard time, because the Chinese see the Dalai Lama as a threat to China. Whether it's justified or not justified, That's the way they see it. But the third point is that, of course, there's also a tremendous opportunities when you have US-China rivalry, because as you know, in response, the US government actually, there's an agency, Ngaire probably knows better, called OPIC, which actually Trump wanted to destroy when he became president. What's interesting, in the 2 years since he became president, when they realized how successful the Belt and Road Initiative was becoming, the United States must launch its own infrastructure initiative. And so under OPIC, if I'm not mistaken, they're giving 60 or 50, $60 billion for OPIC. So that's an example of China coming with gifts for Africa, will help you build infrastructure. America coming with gifts will help you build infrastructure. So take both their gifts and enjoy them.
Next question. Yeah.
Good evening. Fantastic talk. I was very interested towards your I think it was the fourth dimension that you mentioned, culture.
Yes.
That you think you said it was the elephant in the room, and I guess my point goes back to soft power thing, which wasn't very elaborated on. But I was wondering whether you could probably give a sort of estimation as to whether China could actually rival the US in terms of soft power. They could actually supersede the US into areas like cultural exports. Because from where I could see, from where I stand, I see that the English language is still pretty much the dominant business language. Do you see that being superseded by the Chinese language as being the international language for business in the future?
Well, I would say I'll divide your question into two parts. Part one is about American soft power versus Chinese soft power. Second question about English language versus Chinese language. I think they're slightly separate. On American soft power versus Chinese soft power, there's no question that American soft power today is far stronger than Chinese soft power. No question whatsoever. Hollywood, whatever you may name it, universities and all that. But the one thing people forget, by the way, is that soft power must always rest on a strong bedrock of hard power. So, for example, you pick a country that actually is culturally, linguistically, in every sense, a very interesting country is Bangladesh, right? Look at it's incredibly Rabindranath Tagore and so on and so forth. It's got tremendous soft power, but it has no impact on the world because it doesn't rest on a bedrock of hard power. So if you want to have real soft power, you've got to make sure your hard power remains strong also. So right now, the American hard power is, of course, still overall stronger than Chinese hard power. But when the roles reverse, you'll find that Chinese soft power will also grow. There is a correlation between soft power and hard power. And in terms of the numbers of students going to study in China and so on and so forth, it's quite stunning. The rapid increase in the numbers of people studying Chinese is growing and so on and so forth. So Chinese soft power will grow, for sure. But the second question about English language and Chinese language, the Chinese language will not replace the English language. But the English language doesn't belong to either America or UK. The English language has become a global product. And there are probably today more non-Americans, non-English speaking English than Americans who are English. You go to India, for example, right? So the English language will no longer be the property of England, but it become a global public good that will survive and live on, even if China becomes number one.
Kishore, just on your soft power point, I wonder if the power of the Chinese economic model isn't already quite a powerful soft power. What I notice across a lot of poorer parts of the world is that where 30 years ago they might have said we'd like to have the American economic model. Today, they say we'd like the Chinese economic model. It's higher growth. It lifts more people out of poverty. It's more likely to produce opportunity. So there's a desire, there's a yearning for a kind of Beijing consensus. Isn't that soft power?
Well, you want to know why China is succeeding? China is succeeding because it copied the West. And I say here, the enormous improvement in the human condition, page 11, is a result of the slow process of Western ideas and best practices seeping into other societies. And the most important aspect of the Chinese economic model is free markets. Free markets is not a Chinese idea, right? Adam Smith, wherever you may trace it back to. And so a lot of the Chinese success is actually based on a lot of Western ideas. And the Chinese actually are aware of this, The Chinese are acutely aware that they have borrowed a lot of Western ideas, and they'll continue to borrow Western ideas in places like economics and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to culture, right, it'll be a different thing. And here, let me give you another stunning statistic about how the cultural thing is going to be very complex. The one country in the world that is now developing the largest number of new classical musicians, the new violinists, the new pianists, the new cello players is China. The figure is something, I have something like 100 million. The largest number of new Western classical orchestras emerging is in China. The largest number of new dazzling Western classical concert halls is in China. So, this is an example of that. You can't just say it's Chinese and not Western. There is actually in many areas, a lot of intermingling also that's happening.
I'll come back to you about free markets, but first let's have more questions. Yes.
Many thanks. I tend to have a feeling rather like yours, and I'm often under pressure because people have this yellow peril thing hanging over everything. And my answer is very often say, how many Chinese people have you spoken to? And very often the people that are spoken to less, the more they feel under pressure. And there's particular reference, for example, in the South African environment, which I'm very familiar with, where the local stores have been taken over by Chinese people. And some of them don't speak English very well. And there's complaints by blacks and whites in South Africa about these people taking over. And I say, have you actually gone into the store and asked them where they come from and what they like? And the answer is no. And I always think that things start at the very base level of communication. And if people are not prepared, and this is my argument normally over all sorts of dinners and that sort of thing, if you don't bother to communicate at that level, you haven't got a chance. And I say that when I've been to America, when I've been to South Africa, which I go very frequently.
Thank you. That's a lovely reflection. Yeah, and back to... Wait, that was your... Yeah? Yes.
Some Brexit supporters have argued that leaving the EU will give us opportunities to strengthen trade ties between the US and China. How feasible do you think this will be in light of the intensifying US-China rivalry?
So your question is, how feasible is it for the European Union to...
No, I think it's Britain
UK.
Post-Brexit. How likely is it that we will quickly secure new trade relations with China and the United States? Is that right?
Yeah, bearing in mind their intensifying rivalry.
Bearing in mind their rivalry.
I think I must confess, I'm not an expert on Brexit, although I see this as a great tragedy, sadly. But my understanding is that if you accept the current deal where you retain your access to the European markets under the current deal, you are therefore constrained from signing new free trade agreements. And you can only sign free trade agreements if you have a hard Brexit, where you have no special relationship with the EU, then you can go ahead and sign free trade agreements. So that depends. And of course, by the way, for example, Prime Minister May said she wants to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and everybody in the TPP said, yes, come and join us. We'll be happy to have you. But I think it's certainly the UK can do more with both US and China. For example, the UK was very shrewd in the way it became the first Western government to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. That was a very shrewd move on the part of, which angered the United States, as you know, a lot. But it was a shrewd move. Though there will be geopolitical opportunities for the UK, but the UK has first got to sort out its rather messy situation with the European Union first, because if you accept the current deal, you still don't have the freedom that you would have to do what you want to do. That's my understanding, unless I'm wrong.
I think that the question is a little bit, at what point will China and the United States force countries to make a choice? Already in NAFTA, the United States has said, if you want to stay part of NAFTA, you've got to promise not to have an agreement with China. If Britain wants an agreement with China, will it be under pressure not to join the TPP or not to have a free trade arrangement with the United States? I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah, well, I think, oh yes, there's absolutely no question that if the UK tries to sign a free trade agreement with China first, the US will block it, for sure. I mean, the United States is, but you see, again, I'm talking about United States under Trump, okay? I think if it's the United States under Obama, it would be different. I think there'll be a little bit more freedom, but still there'll be unhappiness, as you saw in the AIIB. But the thing that's happening in Washington, D.C. is that, this is what I saw when I was there for 2 weeks in October, there's a very strong anti-China consensus developing in Washington, D.C. And I think it'd be very difficult for the UK to actually sign a free trade agreement per se with China, but it can of course improve its ties with China in many other ways. There are creative ways of doing that. And one other key point I was going to mention, you talk about the poison pill that the United States has put into the MCA, the United States, Mexico-Canada agreement. And there's no question whatsoever that is aimed at China. But of course, the Canadian Prime Minister has stated on record in Singapore that this doesn't prevent us from signing a free trade agreement with China. But I think he has to say that. But we all know that the United States will not allow it.
Yeah. Next question, yes, here.
Good evening, Professor. I was wanting to ask you what your opinion was on if a state was to secede from the Union, what impact would that have on a China-US rivalry? Thank you.
If a state, you mean one of the states in the United States?
Yeah, for example, there's growing kind of support in California, for example, for seceding.
Well, I'm a betting man, and I'm happy to take bets with you that no state will secede from the United States in my lifetime, for sure. You know why? Because secession is a rather difficult and complicated process, and you see this even in like Scotland or the Catalan region in Spain. Secession is not an easy thing. It's not realistic. But at the same time, it's also true that California is benefiting the most from trans-Pacific trade and so on and so forth, and California is not happy with what Washington, D.C. is doing vis-a-vis China and so on and so forth. So California can have a moderating role on Washington, D.C. So one area where California has done very well is that even though Donald Trump refuses to act on climate change, California has gone right ahead to act on climate change. If I'm not mistaken, California and China are doing some things together. So that kind of cooperation can happen, but it will happen without secession.
Who would like the final question? Over here.
Hi. So because of the trade war, the U.S. is putting high tariffs on cheap Chinese goods and vice versa. But to what extent do you think trying to internally improve would be beneficial for both U.S. and China in terms of economics?
You're saying that
might a trade war and protectionism on both sides be good for each economy because it will force them to focus on improving their own economy?
Well, I think it's a very good thing if the United States focuses on improving its economy. It's a very good thing if the Chinese focus on improving their economy. That's a good thing. But we live in a world today where, for all practical purposes, we live in a highly integrated world. So, for example, if you want to create a phone like the iPhone, and you want to really compete with the rest of the world, right? It's very difficult to do it without the parts from China. Very difficult. In fact, Obama tried. He asked Steve Jobs, Mr. Jobs, why don't you bring the jobs back to America? And Steve Jobs said categorically, no, I cannot, Mr. President. Because, you know, even this piece of glass, for example, that you have on top, to get it just right for millions of phones, the same quality, the same thing, you can't do it overnight, you know. There are clusters, competitive clusters in Shenzhen that can do it for you, and you can't overnight create them. So I think Donald Trump's efforts to turn back that will not succeed. And indeed, you know, one thing I didn't mention in my remarks about the US and China, one reason why it's difficult to get a trade agreement between US and China is because the goal of President Trump's advisors like Lighthizer and Navarro is not to try and reduce the bilateral trade deficit. They are trying to decouple the United States and China. Now, they will find that if they try to decouple US and China, even if the United States decouples from China, the rest of the world is not going to decouple from China. So the United States will actually be damaging its own interests if it tries to do that. But that's what they believe is good for America. And that's why it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen on the US-China front, because some of the ideas that are driving this rivalry are very strange ideas, but they're floating.
So, Kishore, just a final reflection. If indeed President Trump's administration want to decouple, doesn't that mean that there'll be less conflict between China and the United States? Because China's greatest fear is an America that's trying to change it internally, that's trying to democratize it. And President Trump's desire to decouple actually addresses that fear while China grows markets in the rest of the world. So doesn't that suggest there could be a coexistence which actually works quite happily for both and just leaves economists horrified, but both countries in relative peace?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised the question, because that's exactly why I said that there's not one dimension driving it. So even if on the economics dimension, even if at the end of the day they still reach a win-win agreement on the economics front, even if a lose-lose decoupling arrangement, you still have the political dimension where the feeling in American circles about the sense of betrayal that China is very strong. You still have the military dimension, and I think the U.S. Navy is going to have a very hard time when it finds it is this is the number 2 Navy in the world, not the number 1 Navy in the world. And then you have the cultural dimension, and then of course you have the whole primacy issue. So resolving one dimension of the 5 dimensions will not in any way reduce the US-China rivalry. By the way, there are also other dimensions, but there's no time to go into them.
Well, with that, Kishore, so that we don't make you late for your next appointment, I wonder if you'd all like to join me in thanking Ambassador, Dean, Professor Kishore Mahbubani for coming and sharing this wonderfully clear view of the dimensions of the relationship between China and the United States. So thank you, Kishore.